It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the relaunch of the Alan Ostro Memorial Lecture Series here at the Portland Art Museum. This endowed biennial lecture series was established by Ed and Sue Cooley in honor of Alan Ostro, a 20-year-old student at Lewis and Clark College whose life was cut short in 1984 by leukemia, a disease he fought for 6 years. Stephen Ostro, Alan's father and former director of this museum, says of his son, and I quote, "Alan was a college student serious about his studies, a sailor, entrepreneur, fisherman, intense reader of books, and, it must be told, gracious admirer of women his age. He was also his younger sister's somewhat overly protective best friend. Alan refused to let his then fatal illness define him, in that he refused to allow his being sick to take precedence over his pursuit of being well. Above all, he remained optimistic, loving, and always ready to laugh. What might have been still resonates." The young Alan Ostro was also a photographer, and Robbert Flick helped him purchase his first proper camera. It is therefore very fitting that Mr. Flick is here to speak to us this evening. A native of Holland, Robbert Flick received a BA at the University of British Columbia and an MA and MFA at UCLA. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California, where he has taught since 1976. A scholar at the Getty Research Institute since 2015, Mr. Flick is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 National Endowments for the Arts Fellowships, and a Flintridge Foundation Award. In 2004, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art organized his first major retrospective titled Trajectories, the photographic work of Robbert Flick. His photographs have appeared in many additional exhibitions, both nationally and internationally, and his work has been collected by more than 40 museums. In a 2014 Art in America review of an exhibition of Mr. Flick's photographs, curator Colin Westerbeck wrote, and I quote, "Editing is always a delicate negotiation in which Flick preserves the objectivity of his process, making the pictures useful to cartographers or geographers, while also intervening aesthetically to create a visual poem that appeals to book critics and art critics. Flick's work has become more agile, precise, and rich. Only the great poets, like Yeats, get better as they get older." Please join me in welcoming Robbert Flick.
Well, thank you for this really kind and overwhelming introduction. I'm honored to be here and to be invited to speak under the aegis of the Alan Ostro Memorial Lecture Series. I very briefly knew Alan in the early 80s when I photographed his sister Michelle and his family. He left us way too soon. What I will be talking about tonight are some of the various mileposts encountered along the road of praxis, that which is inherent when doing things over and over while consistently trying to deal with the present. I want to be precise, and therefore I will be reading for approximately 40 minutes, but you will have pictures to look at, and there will be time for questions afterwards. I will be looking at why I think my pictures from different time periods look the way they do. A bit of zeitgeist media roaming, perhaps, but I also want to do this because of the extraordinary visual times we live in and which appear to turn process assumptions upside down. To mention a few, Instagram, YouTube, iPhoto, Google Street View, Drone View, we no longer embrace the isolated frame. We catch it in the context and on the fly. Our relationship with the lenticular image has radically changed. It has become a soundbite condition, and with that has come another way of seeing and a new grammar of representation, which is still being formed. I don't know what that grammar is. You, this new generation, are the ones who will shape the form and meaning of this current practice. The one thing I'm sure of is that what will emerge will tend to be a collaborative, time-based, probably projected, and may well have a half-life as short as Snapchat. The imagery that is on the screen right now is from my current work, where I believe I am seeking to address a shift in the perception attached to the visual appearance of Los Angeles, one that moves away from open, flowing conditions of light and space to a layered, closed-down, densely textured experience. The work is obtained by photographing from the windows of a commuter train while traveling at speed. I'm still deeply involved with this material and have titled it Commute. I'll return to it with more examples and in more detail later in the talk. With this image, we are still looking at the representation of Los Angeles, but filtered through a host of manipulations. This piece dates from the late 60s. It has its origins in random overlays of multiple exposures from different events of the same piece of film. Overlays that have been chemically manipulated, much in the same way that Photoshop now provides contrast and tone controls. At the time, I would think of film as an endless continuum, and there would be a wish to acknowledge that aspect visually. The idea of multiple exposures was linked to ideas about simultaneity, the use of the I Ching, and there is no such thing as accident. I photographed in this manner for a period of 3 years and evolved several bodies of work. Most important about this way of working was that a photograph became a set of marks on a piece of paper, and that paper might come to constitute an object. Things no longer were pictures of something, but rather objects about something. An articulation that Robert Heineken imbued in us through his practice and teaching. In 1971, I was offered a position at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana and suffered culture shock. For a while, I photographed in multiple exposure mode, but I realized that this was a different time and place. It took me a year to begin to see what and how it was that I might photograph what my subject in Illinois was to be. And with subject, I don't mean subject matter. What I mean with subject is a form of sustained recognition rooted in observation and articulation. The realization that it were the anonymous parts of the landscape, the parts that were so familiar that they became invisible, that created a sense of place. I did not know it, but at the same time, photographers across the United States were also beginning to address the vernacular landscape and seeking appropriate ways for its description. I stayed in Illinois for 5 years, but realized that I needed to return to Los Angeles. And once again, I was in for culture shock. The flowing sense of inquiry that had generated such amazing activity during the late 60s had disappeared by the mid-70s. Appropriation and quotation were dominant modes in the visual arts. What I did find, though, was an active, open-ended generosity among photographic fine arts practitioners, all working intensely and questioning the nature of the photographic representation. However, the open-ended work time I'd found in Champaign-Urbana was gone. I now carried a lot of keys and only had snippets of time to photograph. Often in photographic practice, there comes a moment where place and time create an aha moment. Just as that simple harvested cornfield announced itself to me a year after arriving in Illinois, the parking structure behind my studio in Los Angeles suddenly revealed itself as a potential place to work. I photographed there for some 2.5 years and tried to trace the perceptual shifts in my practice against the purely functional environment of that concrete structure. I came to think of this as working in an arena, both as test and demonstrate. Eventually, I found myself repeating the same questions, and I realized that it was time to move on. By good fortune, just as this started to happen, I was asked to participate in the Los Angeles documentary project. The project would be, to quote from its NEA grant application, a visual examination of the sociological and topographical diversity of one of the most dynamic and unusual cities in the world. In an attempt to acknowledge the scope and visual appearance of Los Angeles, I developed a procedure that was concept-based and theoretically repeatable. I was guided by this in my recollection of medieval city maps, where a bird's eye view provided simultaneous detail and context. What you're looking at is the city of my birthplace, Amersfoort, Holland, from 1577. And what you can see, oops, that was the wrong button, I go back. What you can see here is the view of the city, almost a bird's eye view, and the entry into the city over here via the river, which is that entry over there. And so what you basically can get is a series of images that all relate to each other and provide a context. At the same time, you also get this kind of a construct. So this is what I mean with the notion of the medieval map as a source for structuring potentially shifted images. The work was in part performance, and in part a breakaway from the subjective aspects of documentation. Over the next 10 years, I explored the sequential view methodology in a variety of forms and contexts, until technology provided yet another extension. High-aid video and digital image capture allowed me to photograph while driving. Whereas in some of the sequential view pieces, I had simulated the visual experience of being in the driver's seat, I now literally could trace extended trajectories through the city and map the visual appearances of its changing demographics. The image that we're looking at here is Pico A, 1/3 of a 3-part, 17-mile visual tracing of the north side of Pico Boulevard from Santa Monica to downtown LA. While it is possible to read the image in a Eurocentric fashion from left to right and top to bottom, the overwhelming visual density forces the eye to rest variably across the field, much like the reading of a painting. I am particularly interested in this and see it as a formal extension of the ways in which we might create multiple levels of meaning. And that brings me back to the beginnings. This image is a digital scan of the original LA diary footage of multiple in-camera exposures. I've not shown this work in this unmanipulated form before, and I've only recently started to scan and print it. A selection of these images has just been published by Nazreli Press in its second NZ Library Set edition. As I mentioned, the late 60s were an open-ended time with very few boundaries. I was interested in rendering my photographic experiences of LA and wanted to emphasize the process of that experience. Rather than framing a moment, it became important to acknowledge it. This is crucial. This meant that the act of photographing became a gesture. I was also quite poor and had a limited amount of film. I kept some 80 self-rolled films in a shoebox, and whenever I went out, I would reach in for 4 or 5 of them and return them back into the box when exposed, leaving a snippet of leader so the film could be reused. I would have absolutely no idea what was on which film I put in my camera. I recorded the various encounters and events on high-speed film, 2475. That was developed intentionally for its grain. The source of this image here is threefold. Friends of mine modeling for a drawing class, while viewed in a concave mirror, and an art opening for Ace Gallery of Dwayne Valentine resin sculptures. Or this artiste destruction event, where a piano filled with blood was hammered apart and a collection of mice were set free in mousetrap-filled areas. This destruction performance very much summarized the political conditions of the times and the senseless destruction of human life and landscapes engendered by the Vietnam War. The layering of place and time, when guided by the idea of acknowledgement rather than framing and capture, provided a constant possibility for chance conjunctions that were reflective of a larger scheme and allowed access to the visual biases and interests of the maker. Similarly, the confluence of text and image could create a visual fabric of simultaneities that informed each other and raised questions simultaneously. Sometimes chance conjunctions would speak so loudly that they seemed to enumerate a larger perception, such as in this case a view of LA in motion on the freeways, seemingly orchestrated by Mickey, as if it all were a Disneyland of the mind. An image like this seemed to demand a special emphasis, a way of working where not only the lenticular but also the visceral summary experience of place needed to be acknowledged and brought into the singularity of a print. The duotoned LA diary formed as an enumerative way of working where erasure and mark-making coincided with thoughts about synchronicity, duration, speed, and the momentary, or where the visual contradictions in time and place summarized the inherent ambiguities of LA in the late 60s. Only very little of the LA diary work was represented in my 2004 LACMA exhibit, which literally began with the 1971 Midwest Diary. My interests were in wrestling with the photographic, how to construct images that addressed space and place, encounter and translation into a singular photographic whole. The question becomes where to stand in relation to the immensity of space so that all the parts within the frame are actively partaking of each other and inform the perceived experience. In seeking out the anonymous parts of the landscape, I was unknowingly doing what many other photographers across the country were also doing and asking questions about. We were seeking ways to deal with the vernacular, the man-altered landscape, addressing ways that moved away from an imposed rhetoric of imaging and sought out one that appeared more appropriate, more direct, and unfiltered. In retrospect, this appears to me as a period of a paradigmatic shift where how photographs garnered meaning was deeply challenged, one of which was acknowledged specifically in the 1975 New Topographics exhibit by Bill Jenkins, and another not too much later in Douglas Crimp's 1977 Pictures Show. It becomes important how foreground, middle ground, and horizon line relate to each other on that flat piece of paper that is the photographic print. The separation between the top, the pole, and the trees on the horizon line, that slightest of separation, yet a bonding. It is a way of structuring I really became aware of when making slides for teaching, looking with one eye through the viewfinder of a single-lens reflex at hundreds of Adjays and Evans's reproductions in books. I think of my photographic practice as willfully sustained notations over time, an ongoing conversation with the medium and the temporal manifestations. Sometimes what you think you see connects with visual memories. This row of corn took me back to childhood recollections and sounds of people being marched off to concentration camps. This recollective phenomenon may well disappear from today's practice, where an overflow of visual imagery causes confusions about whether what you respond to is something personally experienced or retrieved from a screen in a darkened room. However, when you work willfully with what you are seeing, you'll see it everywhere. It is an awareness that opens up a host of transformative possibilities, leading to new narratives. Thus, empathy can once again become an active part of one's imaging process. Much of my work stems from an embrace of certain literary traditions, specifically Ezra Pound's ideas about poetry and the translation of Fenelos's essay on the Chinese ideogram as a medium for poetry. Pound also spoke of poetry in terms of Dichtung, condensare, to compress, the bringing together of many parts into a single whole, such as it does in the 1913 Imagist poem In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Pound wrote that in a poem of this sort, one is trying to record the precise instant when a thing outward and objective transforms itself or darts into a thing that is inward and subjective. I should also acknowledge Robert Creeley here, who spoke of his own poetry as an attempt to reach the common water level of understanding. And then you bump into this and you realize it's time to leave. I returned to Los Angeles, where I accepted a position at the art school of the University of Southern California. Behind our studio in Inglewood, I found a parking structure that became an arena where I worked exclusively for the next 2.5 years. With arena, I mean both the place to practice and the place for public display. The parking structure itself was a purely functional structure lacking any aesthetic qualities. I was interested in what shifts of perception and visual articulation would occur over time if I were to photograph there exclusively. Sometimes at the beginning of a process, an encounter with an image occurs that establishes the right to that place as a locale for photographing. In the case of the parking structure, this initial summarizing aha moment set me free to begin and told me that there was work to be done here. Then what began to happen was that what I was seeing began to transfer to wherever I looked. During the process of closely looking at the unvarying three-dimensional space and its two-dimensional rendering, I began to revisit the photographic print and the way images bonded in conjunction, when made to float on paper in a yin-yang configuration. I started talking about the prints in terms of how to balance the visual weights of their component parts. I was interested in the subtle shifts of meaning when the complexities of individual photographs were laid out against each other, not to illustrate or enumerate particularities, but rather to demonstrate a set of meaningful yet ambiguous tensions that affected each subsequent reading of the image, whether as a singular entity or a double unity. I worked intensely on the doubles, but found that increasingly the time and focused intensity necessary to bring the pieces to an active culmination was more than I had available. I was asked to participate in a Los Angeles documentary project and developed a way of working that was specifically based on the existing grid structures of the Los Angeles street map. In this case, following one major artery, Ocean Park Boulevard, towards the sea. This was early in the development of the sequential views, and I felt it necessary to include the street names as reference points. So you get the street names on the side. The particulars of the technical procedures I'd used to place the 100 frames on a single piece of photographic paper are not really that important here, especially now that the computer and Photoshop make this task trivial. What you're looking at here are a series of individual photographs taken along parallel streets. Each photograph was taken from the center of consecutively intersections. For all the photographs, I faced in a westerly direction towards the ocean. I tried to maintain the position of the horizon line across the frames. And this gives you some idea of where the pictures were taken. Oops, here we go again. Not what I want, that's what I want. If you can see, there are some red spots along this line. So I started off on this ridge and photographed in the westerly direction towards the ocean. And every red spot that you're seeing on the map there is a consecutive street and a consecutive way of looking. If you are going to be looking, if you look at the top part here of this image, right here, does it show up? What's going on? At any rate, somewhere over here, that top area there we go. Near the top left-hand side of this image, you'll see this detail. And the system of notation and attendance strategy becomes more clear. Looking down the alley in the bottom left corner frame, right here, come on. Over here, if you look at this picture here, you can see this, what you're seeing in the back here. This part becomes that part, and then behind that. And the same over here. If you look at this picture, this part here is that part. And then over there, another image. Well, the direction of view, by the way, as a brief aside, I had no idea that someone would be handing the bikini-clad lady at the top left a bundle of flowers. Photography and chance do come together. While practicing the direction of view, the direction of view and location were predetermined in relation to the totality of the sequence, when I would release the shutter remained open. I found that this way of working provided an opportunity for inclusion and exclusion of temporal phenomena. It also allowed me to quote a mental conversation with other photographers' work. And in documentary terms, it allowed for a way of suggesting how busy a street might be or who did what, when, and in what context. It also collectively provided a kind of bird's eye view of a particular location, somewhat like the medieval city view. Strangely, the collated 100 frames collectively appear to reflect the sense of spatial experience of that place. To complete the shooting of one of these sequential views would take approximately 4 hours. I was curious about what would happen if I were to look in a northerly direction, keeping the sea to my left, using the same intersections that was shown on the map, but now with crosswalk markings and repetitive patterns. The sequential view also allowed for an expanded set of shooting methodologies. In this case, following the shooting of a panoramic frame selection from a fixed location, as one would do now in preparation for a digital photo merge. Or in this case, whereby following a set of incoming waves while walking on a pier above the waves, simulating the feel of an incoming wave. I was interested too in how these sequential views might evolve in situations where topographic reference points were not readily available. To make this image, I chose to work seeking a landmark on the horizon and moving towards it on foot. If you look to the top, I have to teach myself something here. When you look at the top part there, that would be the objective of the travel. Actually, yeah. Let me go there. If you look at the top part there, this would be the objective, and I would basically travel through the landscape until I would reach that point. To make this image, I chose to work by seeking a landmark on the horizon and moving towards it on foot. As I traversed the landscape, I would acknowledge any shift in visual encounters or perceived space by taking a photograph. Know that these images were taken in the early 1980s, well before GPS and Google Maps became part of our vocabulary. The walk through the landscape became an open meditation on the shapes that formed associations in my mind. Enlarging the individual frames to 11 by 14-inch prints and placing them within yet a larger frame gave access to the extraordinary details inherent in each photograph. At the same time, one had to step back to see the totality of the construct. This back and forth motion between the parts and the whole became an active metaphor for me for photographic practice. Another view of the LACMA installation of 2004. In the foreground, not readable, overmatted in 20 by 24-inch Manhattan Beach prints displayed for close scrutiny. And on the wall, a framed evolution of the image we just saw. Note that it is missing the top line of prints. Photography for me has always been a very particular way of coming to terms with and articulating thoughts about the process of my experiencing of the world. It is an open-ended process, constantly in flux. I try to find ways to invite viewers to scrutinize particulars, to look at details in different places at almost the same time, and to establish relationships between them. The use of the zoom lens provides yet another way towards the rendering and interpretation of a visual encounter from a fixed location. What you're basically looking at is a very small scene. This is basically the scene. But then when you start to closely scrutinize it, you'll notice that with the zoom lens, I have been able to expand it and get into closer. So there are these building up of processes that reflect the actual constructs even more greatly. And so you begin to set up, in a sense, a musical structure. I mentioned chance encounters and photography a few moments ago. I was smitten with the vista of this landscape and decided to trace my progress through it to eventually arrive at the framing shed, only to encounter a sculpture of the very scene in minuscule carved into the top of the pole. So what we're looking at, and I think I have the right button now, is traveling towards this particular shed, which is this shed here, and then discovering, as I'm coming closer and closer, that there is a pole over here, something on top of it, and lo and behold, the pole is an echo of that. So a sculptor had the same idea that, and anyway, just one of those things that happen. Color became important in thinking about documenting Los Angeles. I photographed all of La Cienega on foot through a variety of neighborhoods and demographics on consecutive Sunday mornings, simulating the hopscotch view from the driver's seat. This is a small selection of the area between Beverly and Melrose as one traveled northward on La Cienega. The individual prints are 16 by 20-inch aluminum-mounted Cibachromes. With the computer and high-aid video capture came the ability to construct extended views far beyond the ambulatory practice I'd used so far. I finally found a working method that addressed the visual complexities and simultaneities of the Southern California metropolitan area. Videotaping the city in long, continuous sweeps from a moving vehicle, either by following predetermined trajectories or by systematically rendering parallel streets, allowed me to construct large-scale digital photographic files that could be output in various forms, as individual print portfolios or accordion books of large-scale Cibachromes. The resulting prints are a collection of visual textures and phenomena that capture the appearances of neighborhoods during particular moments in time. This visual sampling, when woven together in consecutive frames and bands, plays on frequencies of occurrence to reveal conditions and to suggest possible contexts for interpretation. The sequences may be read from left to right and top to bottom, much like a Eurocentric text, or dealt with in isolated but related image clusters, where the eye travels across the visual field, much like it does when approaching a painting. This is along a midsection of Pico titled Pico B, and the final section here of this 17-mile Pico corridor titled Pico C. Along Melrose, between Fairfax and Highland. Along Broadway, downtown. And the west side near Venice Beach. The at Cambria sequence, as installed at LACMA, consisting of 3 50 by 80-inch Cibachromes. The image on the screen is a very small segment from one of the Cibachrome prints. The imagery was sequentially collated from a 45-minute high-aid video, shot at dawn from a cliff at Cambria. I pre-selected the location from which to shoot. What I did not know was that the following morning a coastal fog would be moving in and out, and that the tides would be changing at just about dawn. The formal questions I was wrestling with at the time had to do with visual representation and the nature of abstraction, something that consistently raises its head in photographic practice. After all, it is one of the first things one has to accept when working in photography. Photographic images are just marks on paper. Collated together, though, These marks on paper create illusions, suggest narratives and fictions, which may, with their adjacencies in this case, suggest the scanning of an endless expanse of ocean and the functioning of waves. What should be mentioned here, though, is that the video from which these markings were taken was shot from a fixed position with a carefully fixed frame looking in one direction to a spot just below the horizon. So what appears to be unfolding spatially is actually only unfolding temporally. I was fortunate to be selected for the artwork of one of the new metro stations on the USC Expo line. At this point in time, digital cameras had become economically accessible and of a high enough resolution to pursue individual frames of a larger scale than high-8 video. Ironically, at the very moment that analog photography began its disappearing act, the digital photographs, which have an even shorter life expectancies, were here translated into ceramic porcelain, a medium with an extraordinary half-life. My current work takes advantage of being driven by during my commute. Photographing from the window of the shuttle allows a close scrutiny of the multiple levels of contradictory sets of movement simultaneously. And besides the shuttle, there's also the access to the freeway's diamond lane, where the rate of speed increases exponentially in relation to the rest of the traffic. Causing transparencies and visual ambiguities. And in a way, this is one of my favorite freeway images. It does not deal with the particulars of place, but rather addresses the remembered impressions of a freeway during driving experiences. And that's the image that I was thinking of. In my current work, I'm taking advantage of the repetitive passages that a commuter train provides and the attendant insight of it in the ever-increasing population densities. And the transformation of areas near train stations into ever-increasing apartment densities with their attendant problems. This is a wall that has had me marvel at the persistence and urgency of mark-making, layers upon layers of evidence of one of our most basic artistic urges. I photographed it again and again over the last 7 years during the few seconds it took for the train to race by. And this is where we started, a visual indication of a possible perceptual shift in the representation of LA. Thank you. I'm open to questions. I believe that there may be some, maybe not.
So a lot of what you've been talking about has been, it seems like there's like two general themes in which you're like, the way you talk about your work. Because like, I know there's like the praxis part in which like what you actually like how you've constructed a way to like produce the other part, which is like the products. But I was wondering like if you could go more into depth about like the performative aspect as to your work. Like what do you actually like do and feel while you're photographing?
Minor White had a very interesting observation that if a photographer was really aware of what he was doing, he dropped. Minor White had a very interesting comment about what would happen if a photographer was really totally aware of what he was doing. He would drop dead. So what is happening when I'm photographing is, in a sense, a form of meditation. The conversations that I have stop, and there is a perceptual shift that starts to happen. There is, when I was talking about this quote-unquote aha moment, it's a condition that I in a sense seek, and it's a way where both the whatever it is that I'm seeing and whatever it is that will become, and whatever is in front of me becomes a little bit like I was going to say a lens, but it's not quite a lens. It's like a fulcrum point. When the image is a fulcrum point for many different possibilities. That's very, very vague, and the process of doing it is, especially in today's society and the way in which we move through the city, or in the way we move through things, the kind of cultural dance that we go through doesn't allow for the kind of focused attention that is, in a sense, attendant to the extraordinary pictures that may arise. I'm thinking, for instance, of a Curtis picture that is up above here. That was a portrait of, I believe, Lumet woman. It was just an extraordinary image of someone. And the image itself transcends whatever it is that is going on. I hope that answers a little bit of what I'm trying to get to. It's more than just, taking pictures of something. Or it's more than just saying, click, I got you. And it's a longer journey. It's a larger poetry that evolves. And it's yeah.
Is this like a stream of consciousness except visual and not verbal?
Possibly, but there is a tendon to it. Is also the idea that the image that you end up with starts to function separately from you, and it takes on an independent character on the wall or in somebody's encounter with it. And so the demands that I make of that image are far beyond the stream of consciousness that generates that particularity of moment. But it is the process itself is, in a sense, a stream of consciousness.
Allison, so good. Thank you. I would imagine that being at a place like USC for over 3 decades and being surrounded by individuals who are thinking about so many different disciplines would be very stimulating and could bring things to your photographic work. And I'm thinking about Emmett Gowan, who visited us back in November, and having been at Princeton for 36 years, and he worked and talked and thought with geographers and entomologists even. And so I'd love to know if there were particular disciplines within the university that were useful to you or exciting for you, and could you cross-pollinate with them through your own work?
Thank you. That's yes, very much so. Basically what happened was that I initially thought that there would be the conversation among my peers in the art department. However, I found very quickly that the kind of conversations that really sort of were even more interest were with historians, were with geographers and scientists. And so there's the one thing that a university allows you to do is to have a conversation that's far beyond the particularities of the situation that you find yourself in. And that, I think, is what's so great. At this point, I don't know whether that is still the possibility. I mean, there are so many demands that are being made on academia that the kind of cross-cultural exchanges that one seeks to have may not become possible because of the way in which administrations are being set up.
I'm curious if there's a choice that you're making that has some significance of whether you're taking it from, like, most of these seem to be from like a stable point of view, so the camera is moving, and then the picture changes across time, versus a stable point of reference within the photo, and then the camera moves to keep that reference point stable. So I guess I was just like curious about your choice of, I guess, your method of photography and framing.
Did you ask what it was that how I linked up with the subject or subject matter?
No, more of the photograph in particular, like the formal quality of it. These are like a very objective, the camera is steady and it's the same perspective and same cropping of photo. And then what's moving is the camera or you, as like a horizontal axis is moving. So I was curious about what impacted that choice, that formal choice, over like maybe like a change in the perspective point, or like staying with one stable viewpoint within the photo instead of a stable viewer.
It depends on the situation. It really depends on the situation. If we it's what I see here, what I encounter here is a very brief instant in passing. But what I draw from it is the idea of mark making. And so that becomes the subject. And to make that visual in terms of the way in which it's obtained, it starts at the top and you move left to right, and you can see there's a certain kind of logic of a singularity that is, it's a containment within that particular location. Sometimes the horizontality that I'm using has to do with how a picture might work. When I was dealing with the video, very often I would have thousands of images, which I would select from and literally cull out the ones that eventually would end up with an image that I would find interesting. It's a form of starting with an instrument, getting to chamber music, and then hopefully at some point getting towards an orchestra.
Somewhat related question to the last one, but so your recent works are, your photographs are relational. It relates to the previous or the one above. And early on, you had photographs that were singular and autonomous. And now that you've gone through this, I wonder what you think of autonomous photographs. Do you make singular photographs?
I'm living by singular photographs at this point. Every morning I photograph a set of trees and a lakeside. And they're singular images. And I have no idea what it's going to turn into. But I have a feeling that what is beginning to happen is that I'm re-establishing that kind of connection that you are pointing to. It's as if I'm coming full circle.
Thank you.
Hang on.
Well, Robert, I remember the wonderful get-togethers you used to have at your studio behind the famous parking lot. And you had a variety of most interesting people there from all sorts of of different disciplines. And I think that what you just said about the new technology and how we communicate with each other, it's just not the same anymore. I can remember those so fondly. And it was so interesting because I was just a sort of a new person in LA, and it was so exciting to meet all these different people who worked at the university or, you know, or other artists. So, and I think that you and your wife have just done an incredible job of being so such great historians of LA, the way it was and the way it now is. You know, it's just amazing, a body of work. So thank you.
Thank you. The way it was then was, as you know, in the beginning, I said I don't want to wax about the past. Right? It was very lovely, it was wonderful, it was great. But right now, today, this is where we are, and that's what I find fascinating.
Yeah, I had a question about the thinking behind the work of the parking structure as part of the way in which you approach your surroundings and photograph them. There seems to be some difference there which I'm not quite understanding. I mean, it was present behind your studio.
What happened in the parking structure were a set of questions that I was trying to seek out, that I was trying to form. And at some point, the formation of those questions became repetitive. Instead of finding another way of seeing, I saw that I needed to go and look somewhere else. And lo and behold, when I started looking somewhere else, that whole parking structure construct just fell in on me. Mm-hmm. So when the possibility of, when I was asked to do a documentary, be part of a documentary process on Los Angeles, my initial idea was, okay, I'll photograph it. But, how can you photograph Los Angeles in 10 photographs? So at that point, I began to think about how do I travel through Los Angeles? Mm-hmm. How to put this together? So there are a series of conscious choices, some of which you bump into, and many of them you sort of work out as you begin. So in doing that, a whole other set of questions started to arise, and also serious doubts about, am I just being a real estate photographer by going from house to house? And in fact, some of the critics viewed that work that way. It was, however, the totality of that. How can you, if you travel through LA and you at that time when you were being in a car, you could feel when you would enter into a new part of the city because the road was changing. And it had to do with the tax structures of the city. And so all these sort of real conditions began to define and infiltrate in there. But there was always still the need to make a poem.
Thank you.
How much of your work is digital versus film camera work?
At this point, it's all digital. And it simply has to do, I built a very large darkroom. My wife likes to work very large on paper still. I love analog photography. And while I was, the last courses that I was teaching at SC up until May last year were all analog. And so film-based. There's something about the film-based practice that I feel very, very strongly about. And it has to do with the nature of how you experience things. And what happens when you're in a dark room? You have to wait. The first thing that the students who were mostly visually oriented would say is, oh my God, you know, do I have to wait this long? But there's something nice about this waiting, and there's something about that talks about the considered image. You know, you are working towards something, and you have to wait. You can't, you know, you take the pictures, then you have to wait until you process the film. There's something about that slow ambulatory practice that I still very much love, and that to some degree is now beginning to re-emerge in the digital practice. It is not the kind of quick snapshots, but there is some of that that's beginning to re-emerge. You know, again, if you look at some of the work that is upstairs, some of the experimental digital work that is in Curtis or near the Curtis show, some of that begins to have the qualities of the considered image of the film and the really considered image of the present. I hope that answered it.
Yes, thank you.
One more, hang on.
When you work with a series of singular images, you of course are in complete control of how you edit them. You pick the image that you like. When you're doing these documentary things or these sequential things, how heavily do you edit them? I mean, if you're shooting out the window, do you say that this series is not working or that there's parts of it that aren't working?
Basically, I am true to the temporal aspect of it. It takes, say, 57 minutes to get from A to B, and that 57 minutes is the container in which these images are happening. From that 57 minutes, and you know, probably 500 to 800 pictures that come out of that, I select those that talk with each other, and then also then, and there's many of them that shape themselves. But then, just like you do in the analog work, you know, you have your contact sheet. The contact sheet are a series of moments of contact that you had with that world out there. And the same with these pictures. They form certain clusters that are alive for a little while, and then I kick out the clusters that don't make sense to me. It's just being very, you have to be a ruthless individual sometimes with your own pictures.
Thank you.
Are we good? Oh, okay. One more.
Okay.
Could you say a little more about where the waiting is now happening for certain people working in digital? When you were just talking about the difference between analog and digital, the answer to your previous question.
I was thinking specifically of a piece that I saw just this afternoon up there. It's called 3 Generations. And it had both, it had 3 generations of Native Americans and this extraordinary view of the canyonlands and the sky. And it was just, it got to me. But I wonder whether it got to me because it touched my romantic aspects, or whether it was about something that is emerging. I know it's a way of wrestling that is going on in that picture that I think is very interesting. On the other hand, that is sort of working in the tradition of image making and photographic image making and constructed image making. And there's something else that is going on, and that has to do with how people are using their cell phones and how people are really exchanging the kind of conversations that are happening between people over their cell phones visually is fascinating. What happens on Tumblr, what happens on Instagram. A lot of it is, when you look at it, it's, oh my God, it's overwhelming, it's repetition. But there's something else that is taking place, and I don't know what that is, but it seems to make sense. And that's why I said that, you know, the future those people that are working with it probably has to do with time-based work, it has to do with shared work, it has to do with performance, all these parts that are essential to our communication today, which is, and what that form will be and how we will perceive it, I have no idea. My love for the pictures that are just described in terms of the work that I saw this afternoon, briefly running by things, have to do with my own historical biases. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.